Maya Johnson walked home from school on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in spring. The 17-year-old girl carried her backpack over one shoulder, completely unaware that this ordinary day would change everything. She moved through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, passing houses where she had grown up knowing every neighbor by name. Maya was born deaf, but this never stopped her from living a full life. She communicated through sign language with her family and used her phone to text friends when they weren't around to sign with her. Her bright smile and determined spirit made her popular at school, where teachers and students had learned to accommodate her needs naturally. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Maya approached the corner near her home. She didn't hear the police sirens wailing in the distance, growing closer by the minute. A 911 call had been placed 20 minutes earlier about a suspicious person allegedly carrying what looked like a weapon in the area. The caller had been vague about details, mentioning only a young person with something in their hand walking through the neighborhood. Officer Bradley Stevens and his partner Officer Martinez responded to the call with urgency. They had been patrolling this area for 3 years and thought they knew it well. As they drove through the residential streets, their eyes scanned for anything unusual. The radio crackled with updates from dispatch, but the information remained unclear and incomplete. Maya stopped at the crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. She pulled out her phone to check messages from her friends about weekend plans. The device's screen glowed in her hands as she scrolled through texts, completely absorbed in the normal teenage concerns that filled her world. She had no idea that from a distance in the late afternoon light, her phone might look like something else entirely to someone who was already on high alert. The police car rounded the corner just as Maya stepped into the crosswalk. Officer Stevens saw a figure ahead and immediately focused on what appeared to be an object in the person's hands. His training kicked in and adrenaline surged through his system. Years of conditioning and preparation for dangerous situations clouded his judgment in this critical moment. Maya continued across the street, still looking at her phone. She felt the vibration of an incoming text and paused in the middle of the crosswalk to read it. Her friend Sarah was asking about their study group plans for tomorrow's history exam. Maya began typing a response, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. The police car came to an abrupt stop. Officer Stevens jumped out, his hand already moving toward his weapon. His partner followed, both officers now focused entirely on Maya, who remained completely unaware of their presence. The afternoon was quiet except for the distant sound of children playing in nearby yards and the gentle hum of air conditioners running in houses along the street. Officer Stevens shouted commands that Maya could not hear. His voice carried across the empty street, demanding that she drop whatever was in her hands and get on the ground. Maya continued typing her message, having no way of knowing that armed officers were positioning themselves behind their vehicle, treating her as a potential threat. The situation escalated with terrifying speed. Officer Stevens interpreted Maya's continued movement and focus on her phone as non-compliance and potential aggression. His training had taught him to neutralize threats quickly, but his training had failed to prepare him for this moment. Maya finally looked up from her phone, sensing something was different about her surroundings. When Maya turned toward the police car, Officer Stevens saw what he perceived as a threatening gesture. In the span of 3 seconds, everything changed forever. The officer drew his weapon and fired multiple shots. Maya collapsed to the pavement, her phone skittering across the asphalt as the sound of gunfire echoed through the neighborhood. The silence that followed was broken only by Officer Martinez shouting into his radio for an ambulance. Maya lay motionless in the crosswalk, her backpack spilled open beside her, school books scattered across the street. The phone that had caused so much confusion lay cracked a few feet away, its screen still glowing with the unfinished message to her friend. Neighbors began emerging from their houses, drawn by the sound of gunshots in their quiet community. Mrs. Patterson, who lived on the corner, ran toward the scene while dialing 911 on her own phone. She had known Maya since she was a little girl and recognized her immediately. The elderly woman's screams pierced the air as she realized what had happened to the sweet teenager, who always waved to her from across the street. Officer Stevens stood frozen, his weapon still drawn as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The suspect he had perceived as dangerous was a young girl, and the weapon that had seemed so threatening was nothing more than a cell phone. His partner knelt beside Maya, checking for signs of life while desperately calling for medical assistance. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but the damage was already done. Paramedics worked frantically to save Maya's life as neighbors gathered in shocked silence. The scene was secured as a crime scene, but for the community, it felt like something much more profound had been shattered. Trust, safety, and innocence had been lost in those few terrible seconds when fear and misunderstanding collided with deadly consequences. The phone call that would destroy Marcus Johnson's world came at 4:47 p.m., while he was reviewing case files in his office downtown. The FBI agent had been working late, preparing for an important federal investigation, when his personal cell phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to a police sergeant who struggled to deliver news that no parent should ever hear. Marcus dropped everything and raced through the city streets toward the hospital, his mind refusing to accept what he had been told. His daughter Maya, his brilliant and spirited girl, had been shot by police officers who mistook her phone for a weapon. The 20-minute drive felt like hours as he navigated through traffic, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. At the hospital, Marcus found chaos. News vans had already arrived, drawn by reports of another police shooting involving a young black person. He pushed through the crowd of reporters and concerned community members, showing his badge to security guards who recognized the pain in his eyes. Inside, the sterile hallways echoed with his footsteps as he searched desperately for information about Maya's condition. Dr. Patricia Williams, the trauma surgeon, met Marcus in a small consultation room. Her expression was grave as she explained that Maya had survived the initial surgery, but remained in critical condition. 3 bullets had struck her, causing severe damage to her abdomen and left lung. The next 24 hours would be crucial in determining whether she would survive, and if she did, what kind of recovery she might face. Maya's mother, Jennifer, arrived shortly after Marcus. Their divorce 3 years earlier had been amicable, focused on what was best for Maya, but now they sat together in the hospital waiting room, united in their fear and grief. Jennifer worked as a sign language interpreter at the local college and had been in the middle of a lecture when she received the call. She still wore her professional clothes, but her composed demeanor had crumbled entirely. As the evening wore on, Marcus began asking the questions that his FBI training had taught him to ask. He spoke quietly with hospital security, requesting copies of any surveillance footage from the area. He contacted colleagues who could help him understand the legal procedures that would follow. Most importantly, he began gathering information about the officers involved in the shooting. Officer Bradley Stevens had been with the police department for 8 years, with a record that showed several complaints about excessive force, though none had resulted in serious disciplinary action. His partner, Officer Martinez, was newer to the force and had no prior incidents on his record. The 911 call that had initiated their response was traced to a woman named Carol Henderson, who lived 6 blocks away from where Maya was shot. By midnight, Maya remained unconscious, but stable. Marcus sat beside her bed, holding her hand and watching the monitors that tracked her vital signs. Tubes and wires surrounded his daughter, and the sight of her so vulnerable and broken filled him with a rage that threatened to consume him. But his years as a federal agent had taught him that emotion without strategy would accomplish nothing. Jennifer had fallen asleep in the chair on the other side of Maya's bed, exhausted from hours of crying and waiting. Marcus used this quiet time to make phone calls to contacts within the FBI and the Department of Justice. He knew that local investigations of police shootings often resulted in officers being cleared of wrongdoing. But federal involvement could change everything. By morning, word of Maya's shooting had spread throughout the community and beyond. Social media posts about the incident had been shared thousands of times, with many people expressing outrage that a deaf teenager had been gunned down while simply walking home from school. Local civil rights organizations were already planning protests and demanding immediate action from city officials. Marcus met with the hospital's administration early that morning, insisting on increased security for Maya's room. He had received dozens of calls from reporters wanting to interview him, but he refused all requests. His focus remained entirely on his daughter's recovery and on ensuring that justice would be served. The police department held a press conference that afternoon, with Chief Robert Williams attempting to manage the growing public outrage. He stated that the officers had been placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation was conducted. He emphasized that they had responded to a legitimate 911 call and had followed their training in what they perceived to be a dangerous situation. Marcus watched the press conference from Maya's hospital room and felt his anger intensify. The chief's words sounded like prepared statements designed to protect the department rather than seek truth or justice. The suggestion that Maya had somehow contributed to the situation by not following officers' commands ignored the obvious fact that she could not hear those commands. That evening, Maya briefly regained consciousness for the first time since the shooting. She could not speak because of the breathing tube, but her eyes found her father's face and she squeezed his hand weakly. Marcus leaned close to her and began signing, telling her that he loved her and that she was safe. Maya's eyes filled with tears, and Marcus realized that she understood what had happened to her. Dr. Williams cautiously optimistic about Maya's progress, explaining that the next few days would determine the extent of her recovery. There would likely be months of rehabilitation ahead, and some of her injuries might result in permanent limitations. Marcus absorbed this information while maintaining his composure, but inside he was already planning his next moves. Late that night, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He contacted his supervisor at the FBI and formally requested that the Bureau open a federal civil rights investigation into Maya's shooting. He knew that this decision would make him many enemies within local law enforcement, but he also knew that it was the only way to ensure that his daughter's case received the attention and resources it deserved. As he sat beside Maya's bed in the quiet hours before dawn, Marcus Johnson transformed from a grieving father into something more dangerous to those who had harmed his child. He was now a federal agent with unlimited resources, extensive connections, and an unshakable determination to see justice done. The people responsible for shooting his daughter had no idea what was coming for them. The FBI's involvement changed everything within 48 hours of Maya's shooting. Special Agent Sarah Chen arrived from the Bureau's Civil Rights Division in Washington, bringing with her a team of investigators who specialized in cases involving police misconduct. Marcus had worked with Chen on several cases over the years and knew her reputation for thoroughness and determination. Agent Chen immediately established a command center at the local FBI field office, separate from the police department's own investigation. This was crucial because it ensured that evidence could not be tampered with or suppressed by local authorities, who might want to protect their officers. The federal investigation would run parallel to the internal police investigation, but with far more resources and independence. The first major breakthrough came when FBI technicians recovered surveillance footage from 3 different sources near the shooting scene. A traffic camera at the intersection captured the entire incident from beginning to end. 2 nearby businesses had security cameras that showed different angles of the confrontation. Most importantly, a doorbell camera from a house across the street provided clear audio of the officer's commands that Maya could never have heard. Maya's condition continued to improve slowly, though she remained in intensive care. She was now able to communicate through sign language for short periods, though she tired easily. When Agent Chen interviewed her, Maya's account was heartbreaking in its simplicity. She had been walking home, texting her friends, completely unaware that anyone considered her a threat. She remembered looking up and seeing police officers, then nothing until she woke up in the hospital. The 911 call that started everything became a focal point of the investigation. Carol Henderson, the woman who made the call, was interviewed extensively. She admitted that she had seen Maya from a distance and assumed the worst based on little more than her own fears and prejudices. She could not clearly describe what Maya was actually doing, acknowledging that she had been inside her house, looking out through window blinds when she made the call. Agent Chen's team also discovered that Officer Stevens had a history that the police department had failed to properly address. Beyond the complaints already on his record, they found that he had been involved in 3 other incidents where he had drawn his weapon unnecessarily. In 2 cases, citizens had filed complaints that were dismissed by the department's internal review process. The pattern suggested an officer who was quick to perceive threats where none existed. The forensic evidence painted a clear picture of what had actually happened. Maya's phone was examined and showed no damage except from hitting the pavement after she was shot. The text message she had been typing to her friend was still in the draft folder. "Yes, I can study tomorrow. Meet at the library at 3? The innocent nature of her final action before being shot highlighted the tragic misunderstanding that had nearly cost her life. Meanwhile, public pressure on the police department and city officials continued to mount. Protesters gathered daily outside City Hall and the police station, demanding that Officer Stevens be arrested and charged with attempted murder. The hashtag #TalkYourJusticeForMaya spread across social media platforms, drawing national attention to the case. Celebrities and politicians began weighing in, calling for accountability and reform. Marcus remained focused on his daughter's recovery, while Agent Chen handled the investigation. Maya was finally moved out of intensive care after a week. Though she still faced months of rehabilitation, physical therapy would be necessary to help her regain full use of her left arm, which had been damaged by one of the bullets. The emotional trauma would require counseling and support for years to come. The police union immediately hired expensive attorneys to represent Officer Stevens and began a public relations campaign to defend his actions. They argued that he had responded appropriately to a perceived threat and that the shooting was a tragic accident rather than a criminal act. Union President Mike Donnelly gave several interviews claiming that officers had to make split-second decisions in dangerous situations. Agent Chen methodically dismantled these defenses by focusing on the facts. The surveillance footage showed that Maya never made any threatening gestures toward the officers. She never raised her phone in a way that could reasonably be mistaken for pointing a weapon. Most damaging to Officer Stevens's defense was audio evidence showing that he fired his weapon within seconds of arriving on scene, giving Maya no reasonable opportunity to comply with commands she could not hear. The FBI's investigation also revealed systemic problems within the police department. Training records showed that officers received minimal instruction on interacting with disabled individuals. There were no protocols for identifying or accommodating deaf citizens during police encounters. The department had ignored recommendations from disability advocacy groups to implement such training programs. 3 weeks after the shooting, Agent Chen presented her preliminary findings to federal prosecutors. The evidence supported charges against Officer Stevens for violating Maya's civil rights under federal law. The case was strong enough that prosecutors felt confident they could secure a conviction, but they wanted to continue gathering evidence to ensure the strongest possible case. Maya's first public appearance since the shooting came when she was discharged from the hospital. Surrounded by family, attorneys, and supporters, she used sign language to deliver a brief statement that her mother interpreted. She thanked the medical staff who had saved her life and the community for their support. Most importantly, she called for changes in police training so that no other deaf person would face what she had experienced. The police department's internal investigation concluded predictably that Officer Stevens had acted within policy and would not face disciplinary action. Chief Williams announced that the officer would return to duty after completing additional training. This decision sparked immediate outrage and led to the largest protest the city had seen in decades. Marcus watched these developments with grim satisfaction. The contrast between the police department's weak internal investigation and the FBI's thorough federal investigation would be crucial in federal court. The local authorities had essentially admitted that shooting a deaf teenager for holding a phone was acceptable behavior under their policies, making the case for federal intervention even stronger. As Maya began the long process of physical and emotional recovery, her father prepared for the legal battle that would determine whether anyone would be held accountable for nearly killing his daughter. The FBI investigation was entering its final phase, and federal prosecutors were preparing to present the case to a grand jury. Justice was finally within reach, but Marcus knew that the hardest fights were still ahead. The federal grand jury convened 6 weeks after Maya's shooting, and the proceedings were unlike anything the local courthouse had ever seen. Agent Chen presented evidence for 3 days, methodically building a case that Officer Bradley Stevens had violated Maya Johnson's constitutional rights by using excessive force against her. The 23 citizens who made up the grand jury listened intently as the full scope of the tragedy was laid out before them. The surveillance footage played a central role in the proceedings. Grand jurors watched in shocked silence as the video showed Maya walking peacefully across the street, completely unaware of the approaching police car. They saw Officer Stevens exit his vehicle with his hand already on his weapon, and they witnessed the shooting that occurred within seconds of his arrival. The footage made clear that Maya never posed any threat to anyone. Dr. Patricia Williams testified about Maya's injuries and the extensive medical treatment required to save her life. She explained how close Maya had come to death and detailed the permanent limitations she would face as a result of her wounds. The doctor's testimony was particularly powerful because it helped grand jurors understand the severity of what had happened and the long-term consequences Maya would endure. The grand jury also heard from experts in police procedures and disability rights. Former police chief David Martinez, now a consultant on law enforcement training, testified that Officer Stevens had failed to follow basic protocols for assessing and responding to potential threats. Dr. Amanda Foster, a specialist in deaf education, explained how Maya's deafness would have made it impossible for her to hear or respond to the officer's commands. Maya herself appeared before the grand jury, accompanied by a sign language interpreter. Her testimony was brief but emotionally powerful. She described her normal day at school, her walk home, and the moment she looked up to see police officers before everything went black. Grand jurors were visibly moved as they watched this articulate teenager describe how her life had been forever changed by those few seconds of violence. Marcus testified about the impact on his family and his efforts to seek justice through proper channels. He carefully avoided mentioning his FBI connections, presenting himself simply as a father fighting for his daughter. His composed demeanor and methodical presentation of facts impressed the grand jurors, who could see that this was not an emotional outburst but a systematic pursuit of accountability. The defense attorneys representing Officer Stevens were not allowed to present their case during grand jury proceedings, but they were already preparing their strategy for trial. They planned to argue that Stevens had acted reasonably based on the information available to him at the time. They would claim that the 911 call and Maya's behavior created a situation where any reasonable officer would have perceived a threat. After 3 days of testimony, the grand jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a true bill, formally indicting Officer Stevens on federal civil rights charges. The charges carried a potential sentence of up to 10 years in prison if convicted. The indictment sent shockwaves through the local police department, as it was rare for officers to face federal charges for on-duty shootings. The indictment triggered immediate responses from various groups. Civil rights organizations celebrated it as a step toward accountability, while police unions across the country denounced it as federal overreach that would make officers hesitant to protect themselves and the public. The case became a national symbol of the ongoing struggle over police accountability and the treatment of disabled individuals by law enforcement. Maya's recovery continued during this period, though progress was slower than her family had hoped. Physical therapy sessions were helping her regain strength in her left arm, but she still experienced significant pain and limited mobility. More challenging was the psychological trauma she experienced whenever she saw police officers or heard sirens. Her therapist explained that this was a normal response to such a traumatic event, but it would require ongoing treatment. The police department faced increasing pressure to reform its policies and training procedures. City council members called for Chief Williams's resignation, arguing that his leadership had created a culture where excessive force was tolerated. The mayor appointed a civilian oversight committee to review police practices, though critics argued this was too little, too late. Media attention intensified as the trial date approached. National news networks sent reporters to cover the story, and Maya's case became part of broader discussions about police reform and disability rights. Documentary filmmakers requested permission to follow the case, though the family declined most media opportunities to protect Maya's privacy. Agent Chen continued her investigation even after the indictment, knowing that federal prosecutors would need an airtight case to secure a conviction. She interviewed dozens of witnesses and reviewed hundreds of hours of police radio communications and body camera footage. Her team also examined Officer Stevens' training records and personnel files, building a comprehensive picture of his decision-making process on the day of the shooting. The defense team hired their own experts to challenge the prosecution's case. They brought in former police officers who would testify that Stevens' actions were reasonable under the circumstances. They also planned to argue that Maya's failure to immediately drop her phone and comply with commands contributed to the tragic outcome. Despite knowing she could not hear those commands, federal prosecutors, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Torres, prepared their case with the understanding that conviction rates in police shooting cases were historically low. They knew they needed to present evidence so compelling that the jury would have no choice but to find Stevens guilty. The pressure was enormous, as a not guilty verdict would send a message that federal authorities were powerless to hold police officers accountable for excessive force. As the trial approached, Maya began making public appearances to advocate for police reform and disability rights. Speaking through interpreters at community forums and civil rights gatherings, she demonstrated remarkable courage and maturity. Her message was simple but powerful. No one should face what she had faced simply because they were different or because officers were inadequately trained to handle encounters with disabled individuals. Marcus watched his daughter's transformation from victim to advocate with mixed emotions. He was proud of her strength and determination, but he wished she had never been forced to become a symbol of injustice. As an FBI agent, he understood the importance of her case in establishing precedents for federal involvement in police misconduct cases. As a father, he simply wanted his daughter to be safe and whole again. The stage was now set for a trial that would determine not only Officer Stevens' fate, but also whether federal authorities could successfully prosecute local police officers for civil rights violations. The outcome would have implications far beyond one family's quest for justice, potentially affecting how police departments across the country train their officers and handle encounters with disabled citizens. The federal courthouse was packed on the first day of Officer Bradley Stevens' trial, with overflow crowds gathering outside despite heavy security. Media trucks lined the street while protesters held signs demanding justice for Maya. Inside, 12 jurors and 4 alternates had been selected after a lengthy, voir dire process that focused heavily on potential bias regarding police, officers, and disabled individuals. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Torres delivered an opening statement that was both powerful and precise. She told the jury that this case was about a police officer who shot first and asked questions later, violating the constitutional rights of an innocent teenager. Torres explained that Maya Johnson was doing nothing more dangerous than walking home from school and texting her friends when Officer Stevens decided she was a threat worth killing. The defense attorney, prominent criminal lawyer Michael Hayes, presented a very different narrative. He argued that Officer Stevens had responded to a legitimate 911 call about a suspicious person with what appeared to be a weapon. Hayes claimed that the officer had made a split-second decision based on his training and experience, and that the tragic outcome was an accident rather than a crime. He emphasized the dangers that police officers face daily and asked jurors to consider the situation from Stevens' perspective. The prosecution's first witness was Maya herself, who took the stand wearing a simple blue dress and maintaining calm composure, despite the packed courtroom. Through her sign language interpreter, she described her normal day at school, her walk home, and her complete unawareness that anyone considered her a threat. Her testimony was particularly powerful when she described waking up in the hospital and learning what had happened to her. Under cross-examination, Hayes attempted to suggest that Maya should have been more aware of her surroundings and more responsive to police presence. However, his questioning backfired when Maya calmly explained through her interpreter that being deaf meant she experienced the world differently, and that she had no way of knowing police officers were trying to get her attention. The jury appeared uncomfortable with Hayes' line of questioning, and several jurors looked sympathetic toward Maya. Agent Chen testified for most of the second day, methodically presenting the evidence the FBI had gathered. She explained how surveillance footage contradicted Officer Stevens' initial report about Maya's behavior. The agent showed how phone records proved Maya was simply texting her friend about homework, not engaging in any suspicious activity. Chen's testimony was devastating to the defense because it demonstrated that Stevens had either lied about what he saw or had completely misperceived the situation. The surveillance footage was played multiple times during Chen's testimony, and its impact on the jury was obvious. They watched Maya walking normally across the street, looking at her phone like any teenager might do. They saw Officer Stevens arrive on scene with his weapon already drawn, and they witnessed the shooting that occurred within seconds. The video made clear that Maya never made any threatening gestures or movements toward the officers. Dr. Patricia Williams returned to testify about Maya's injuries and treatment. She used medical charts and photographs to show the jury the extent of damage caused by the 3 bullets that struck Maya. The surgeon's testimony was graphic, but necessary, helping jurors understand how close Maya had come to death and the permanent disabilities she would face. Several jurors appeared visibly shaken by the medical evidence. The prosecution also called Carol Henderson, the woman who had made the 911 call that brought police to the scene. Henderson was clearly uncomfortable on the witness stand as she admitted that she had not actually seen Maya doing anything threatening. Under questioning from Torres, she acknowledged that her call had been based more on her own assumptions and fears than on any specific criminal behavior she had observed. Officer Martinez, Stevens' partner on the day of the shooting, provided crucial testimony for the prosecution. He admitted that he had been surprised by how quickly Stevens had drawn his weapon and fired. Martinez testified that he had not perceived Maya as an immediate threat and would have preferred to observe the situation longer before taking any action. His testimony contradicted the defense's claim that any reasonable officer would have responded as Stevens did. The defense called several character witnesses for Officer Stevens, including fellow officers who testified about his dedication and service record. However, these witnesses struggled under cross-examination when Torres presented evidence of Stevens' previous complaints and incidents involving excessive force. The prosecution's strategy of demonstrating a pattern of poor judgment and quick resort to violence was clearly effective. Former Police Chief David Martinez testified as an expert witness for the prosecution, explaining how Stevens had violated basic police procedures. Martinez described how officers should assess situations before drawing weapons and how they should attempt to de-escalate conflicts whenever possible. He testified that Stevens' actions fell far below the standards expected of professional law enforcement officers. The defense's expert witness, retired Police Captain James Wilson, argued that Stevens had followed his training and department policies. However, Torres effectively challenged Wilson's testimony by showing how the department's policies themselves were inadequate and how Stevens had failed to follow even those limited guidelines. Wilson was forced to admit that shooting an unarmed teenager within seconds of arriving on scene was not optimal police work. Maya's mother, Jennifer, provided emotional testimony about her daughter's suffering and the family's ongoing struggles. She described Maya's nightmares, her fear of police officers, and the extensive therapy required to help her cope with the trauma. Jennifer's testimony helped humanize Maya for the jury and demonstrated the lasting impact of Stevens' actions on an entire family. Marcus Johnson's testimony was carefully crafted to focus on his role as a father rather than his position with the FBI. He described receiving the phone call about Maya's shooting and the agonizing hours in the hospital waiting to learn if she would survive. His composed but clearly emotional testimony resonated with parents on the jury who could imagine facing similar circumstances. On the final day of testimony, Officer Stevens took the stand in his own defense. He maintained that he had perceived Maya as a threat and had responded appropriately to protect himself and his partner. However, Stevens struggled under Torres's cross-examination when confronted with the surveillance footage that contradicted his version of events. His credibility was further damaged when he admitted that he had not attempted to communicate with Maya before shooting her. The closing arguments lasted an entire day, with both sides making passionate appeals to the jury. Torres argued that Stevens had violated his oath as a police officer and Maya's constitutional rights through his reckless and unnecessary use of deadly force. Hayes maintained that Stevens was a good officer who had made a tragic mistake in a dangerous situation, and that criminal conviction was not appropriate for what was essentially an accident. As the jury began their deliberations, Maya and her family waited anxiously at the hotel where they had been staying throughout the trial. The case had consumed their lives for months, and they knew that the verdict would determine not only whether Stevens faced consequences for his actions, but also whether other officers might think twice before using excessive force against disabled individuals in the future. The jury deliberated for 18 hours over 3 days, sending several notes to the judge requesting to review specific pieces of evidence. They asked to see the surveillance footage again, requested transcripts of Officer Martinez's testimony, and wanted clarification on the legal standards for civil rights violations. The extended deliberation made everyone nervous, As quick verdicts usually favored one side or the other decisively, Maya and her family spent those 3 days in their hotel, surrounded by supporters but trying to maintain normal routines. Maya continued her physical therapy sessions and worked with her tutor to keep up with her studies. She had missed most of her senior year due to the shooting and recovery, but she was determined to graduate on time. The waiting was almost unbearable, especially for Marcus, who understood better than most how unpredictable jury verdicts could be. On Friday afternoon, the jury announced they had reached a verdict. The courthouse filled quickly as word spread through the community and media. Maya sat between her parents in the front row, wearing the same blue dress she had worn while testifying. She appeared calm outwardly, but those who knew her could see the tension in her shoulders and the way she gripped her mother's hand. Judge Patricia Coleman called the court to order and asked the jury foreman, a middle-aged teacher named Robert Chen, to announce the verdict. The courtroom was completely silent as Chen stood and unfolded the paper containing the jury's decision. After 18 months of investigation, prosecution, and trial, everything came down to this single moment. On the charge of violating the civil rights of Maya Johnson under color of law, we the jury find the defendant, Bradley Stevens, guilty as charged. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before their meaning fully registered. Maya began crying quietly, overwhelmed by relief and emotion. Behind them, supporters erupted in quiet celebration while Stevens sat motionless at the defense table. The judge polled each juror individually to confirm the verdict, and all 12 affirmed their decision. Judge Coleman thanked them for their service and scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. As court was dismissed, Maya was surrounded by family, attorneys, and supporters who had fought alongside her for justice. The moment felt surreal after so many months of uncertainty and struggle. Outside the courthouse, Assistant U.S. Attorney Torres held a press conference to discuss the verdict. She explained that the jury had sent a clear message that police officers could not violate citizens' constitutional rights with impunity, regardless of their badge or uniform. Torres emphasized that the case was about accountability and ensuring that all citizens, including those with disabilities, received equal protection under the law. Maya also spoke to the media, using sign language while her mother interpreted. She thanked the jury for their careful consideration of the evidence and expressed hope that Officer Stevens would use his time in prison to reflect on what he had done. Most importantly, she called for comprehensive police reform and better training on disability issues to prevent future tragedies. The conviction sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies nationwide. Police unions denounced the verdict as a dangerous precedent that would make officers hesitant to protect themselves and the public. However, disability rights advocates and civil liberties organizations celebrated it as a breakthrough in holding police accountable for excessive force against vulnerable populations. 6 weeks later, Judge Coleman sentenced Officer Stevens to 8 years in federal prison, near the maximum allowed under the sentencing guidelines. She explained that the sentence reflected the severity of his actions and the need to deter similar conduct by other officers. Stevens would also be required to complete community service and participate in disability awareness programs upon his release. The police department faced its own reckoning in the aftermath of the conviction. Chief Williams resigned under pressure, and the mayor appointed a reform-minded replacement who immediately began overhauling training programs and policies. The city also agreed to pay Maya and her family a substantial settlement, though money could never fully compensate for what she had endured. Maya's recovery continued slowly but steadily. She graduated from high school 6 months late but with honors, and she was accepted to several colleges where she planned to study social work and disability advocacy. Her experience had given her a mission to help other disabled individuals navigate systems that were often hostile or indifferent to their needs. Agent Chen was promoted within the FBI's Civil Rights Division and became a national expert on police misconduct cases. She used Maya's case as a training example for other agents and prosecutors, demonstrating how thorough federal investigations could succeed where local authorities failed to act. Marcus returned to his regular FBI duties, but remained involved in civil rights cases, bringing a personal understanding of injustice that made him even more effective in his work. The experience had changed him profoundly, teaching him that the system he served could be both protector and perpetrator, depending on who held power and how they chose to use The case established important legal precedents that would affect police misconduct prosecutions for years to come. Federal prosecutors across the country began using similar strategies to hold officers accountable for excessive force, particularly in cases involving disabled victims. The conviction proved that federal civil rights laws could be effective tools for achieving justice when local systems failed. Maya's advocacy work expanded as she entered college. She testified before congressional committees about police reform and disability rights, always emphasizing that her case was not unique, but rather part of a larger pattern of discrimination and violence against vulnerable populations. Her articulate presentations and personal story made her one of the most effective voices in the movement for police accountability. The police department implemented comprehensive reforms over the following 2 years. All officers received extensive training on interacting with disabled individuals, including specific protocols for identifying and accommodating deaf citizens. Body cameras became mandatory for all patrol officers, and civilian oversight committees were given real power to investigate misconduct complaints. Officer Martinez, Stevens's former partner, became an advocate for police reform within the department. He worked with training instructors to develop scenarios that taught officers to slow down and assess situations before resorting to force. His insider perspective on what had gone wrong that day made him credible with fellow officers who might otherwise resist change. The 911 caller, Carol Henderson, faced her own consequences for the role her prejudiced assumptions had played in the tragedy. While not criminally charged, she became the subject of a civil lawsuit and community condemnation. She eventually moved away from the area, unable to cope with the guilt and social ostracism that followed her actions. Maya's high school created a scholarship in her name for students pursuing careers in social justice or disability advocacy. The annual ceremony became a powerful reminder of how one person's courage in the face of injustice could inspire positive change in an entire community. Students who received the scholarship often went on to work in fields where they could make a difference for vulnerable populations. 5 years after the shooting, Maya graduated from college with highest honors and was accepted to law school with plans to specialize in civil rights law. She had overcome not only her physical injuries, but also the psychological trauma of her experience. Though she still attended regular therapy sessions and remained cautious around police officers, the conviction of Officer Stevens marked a turning point in how federal authorities approached police misconduct cases. The success of Maya's case encouraged other families to seek federal intervention when local investigations proved inadequate. Civil rights organizations developed strategies based on the precedents established in her prosecution. Marcus often reflected on how different things might have been if he had not been an FBI agent with the knowledge and connections necessary to push for federal involvement. He wondered how many other families had faced similar injustices without the resources to fight back effectively. This awareness drove him to mentor other parents navigating the complex legal system after their children became victims of police violence. Maya's story became the subject of documentaries, books, and academic studies examining police reform and disability rights. However, she always insisted that the focus should remain on systemic changes rather than her personal experience. She understood that her case was important, not because she was special, but because what happened to her could happen to anyone. The intersection of disability rights and police accountability became Maya's life's work. She established a foundation that provided legal support to disabled individuals who faced discrimination or violence from law enforcement. The organization also worked with police departments nationwide to improve their training and policies regarding disabled citizens. 10 years after Officer Stevens was sentenced, Maya stood before the same courthouse where justice had been served, but this time as a newly graduated attorney, ready to take on her first civil rights cases. Her father Marcus stood beside her, proud of the woman she had become and the changes she had